The 14-year-old boy just wanted to deposit a scholarship check with his own hands and efforts. But when he stepped into the bank with his brown skin and worn backpack, he was not only suspected, but also detained as a suspect. He was denied the right to call home. He stood under judgmental eyes in a silence that seemed to last forever. Elijah Carter didn't shout. He documented everything, with a pen and a small black notebook he kept in his backpack. And when his father, Daniel Carter, a powerful black CEO, walked in, he didn't need to get angry. He only needed the truth that his son had written down. This wasn't just a story about an act of racial discrimination. It was a story about justice regained through intellect, courage, and a father who knew when to speak up to make the entire system bow its head. Elijah Carter walked with his heart full of anticipation. He wore his Wester Academy school uniform, a navy blazer, striped tie, brown leather shoes, and his old but carefully cleaned backpack. Today was a special day. In that backpack, Elijah carefully placed a $5,000 check, the prestigious scholarship he had earned due to his excellent academic performance. Not a merit scholarship, not a scholarship for disadvantaged students, but a scholarship for the top students in one of the most rigorous schools in the country. Standing before the large glass door with the golden lettering Prestige Oak Federal Bank, Elijah took a deep breath. He knew this wasn't mandatory. His father, Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter & Cole Investments, had offered to have his personal assistant take care of all the bank paperwork. But Elijah had refused. "I want to do this on my own, Dad," he had said the day before. "I think it's time I learn how to handle my own money." Daniel had smiled, a rare smile full of pride, and gently patted his son's shoulder. "All right, but remember, you're a Carter. Hold your head high and walk like you deserve it." And now, Elijah stood in the grand hall of one of the oldest banks in the city. The scent of oak and granite lingered in the air. The polished counters reflected the light from the high crystal chandeliers. Under the gaze of many adults in business suits, the 14-year-old boy suddenly felt small. But that didn't stop him. His heart pounded, partly because he wasn't used to this environment, partly because he was nervous standing before adults without anyone by his side. But deep inside, Elijah felt ready. This wasn't just a simple task. This was the first step on his journey to becoming an independent man, just like his father, the one Elijah admired the most. He walked up to the counter, patiently stood in line, holding the stack of paperwork, the scholarship check, the school confirmation letter, student ID, and even his birth certificate, just in case. Elijah had prepared well. He didn't want anyone to think he wasn't serious. When his turn came, he smiled and told the teller, "I'd like to deposit this check into my account. This is my scholarship." The young teller, a man named Tom Reeves, took the check, glanced at it, and then froze when he saw the amount. He looked up at Elijah, then back at the check. That gaze. For the first time that day, Elijah felt uncomfortable. It wasn't the look of someone verifying the validity of the check. It was the look of suspicion, as if Elijah had done something wrong. And then, from the right, the sound of high heels clicking on the marble floor, followed by a woman walking over. Victoria Hayes, the bank branch manager, tall and slim, with wavy blonde hair and a light gray vest with a shiny gold badge. She looked like she stepped out of a financial magazine, elegant but cold. Victoria didn't look at Elijah, just glanced at the check in Tom's hand, then spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. $5,000 for a student? Where did he get that from? Elijah's face reddened. He quickly handed over the scholarship confirmation letter and his student ID, his voice calm. "I study at Wester Academy. This is a merit scholarship. All the paperwork is here." But Victoria didn't take them, nor did she read them. She crossed her arms, briefly scanned Elijah from head to toe, and then quietly, but coldly said, "We've had a lot of fake checks recently. It needs to be verified." Elijah felt his face burn. Something strange welled up inside him. It wasn't fear. It was a feeling of wounded pride. But he swallowed it down, trying to stay calm. He thought of his father's words, "Hold yourself together." Being strong doesn't mean yelling. "Can I call my dad?" he asked. "I left my phone at school. He's waiting for me to come home." Victoria frowned and waved her hand dismissively, as if brushing away an annoying breeze. "Not our problem. You stand there. Wait until the verification process is done." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Elijah standing frozen in the middle of the lobby, under the curious gazes of the entire bank. The proud morning he had felt just moments ago was beginning to change. Less than 5 minutes after entering, Elijah Carter realized he was not being treated like a customer. He was being treated like a threat that needed to be monitored. And in that moment, Elijah Carter, who walked into the bank with hope in his heart, suddenly found himself stripped of every right to be respected. Victoria Hayes' words echoed clearly and maliciously in the luxurious space of Prestige Oak Federal Bank. A 14-year-old student with a $5,000 check? Where did you get this money, kid? Her voice wasn't exactly angry, but something far more terrifying. Contempt wrapped in a cold, deliberate tone, purposefully emphasizing every word. It was as if she was telling everyone that Elijah didn't belong there, at least not with such a large sum of money in his hands. Tom Reeves, the young teller, was initially only a bit surprised, but when he saw the manager walk over and look at Elijah with a suspicious gaze, he immediately changed his attitude. He examined the check under the light, bent the corner of the paper, then whistled lightly as if exposing a child's clumsy trick. No apology, not a single word like, "Please wait a moment." Elijah, though his heart pounded, fought to suppress his frustration. He handed over the scholarship confirmation signed by the principal of Wester Academy, along with his student ID and barcode. "I study at Wester. This is an academic scholarship. All the paperwork is here." Victoria glanced at the stack of papers, but didn't take them. She crossed her arms, pursed her lips as if she'd just heard an old, tired joke. Her gaze was full of suspicion, as though the truth Elijah had just spoken was a poorly scripted performance. "We've had a lot of fake checks recently. Some people exploit students. It sounds reasonable, but then it turns out to be all forged documents." She said this without looking at him. Her voice wasn't loud, but she made sure to speak just loudly enough for a white woman standing behind the counter to whisper, "Oh, really? I read about that in the news." A man in a suit nearby chuckled softly and shook his head. Elijah could feel the weight of their eyes boring into him. No one asked about the truth. No one cared that a black student might win a scholarship through actual talent. All they saw was his skin, and then they judged. Victoria didn't stop. She turned to Tom. "Keep the check. I'll handle the verification. As for the boy, let him stand over there." Then, turning to Elijah, she nodded slightly, but not with respect, more like a cold command. "Go over there. Don't disrupt the transactions of other customers." He slowly walked to the corner near the consultation counter, under the bright white lights and between the rows of expensive wooden chairs. But he didn't sit. No one told him he was allowed to sit. Elijah stood there, gripping his backpack straps tightly. The cold of the marble floor seeped through the soles of his shoes, making his feet numb. In his mind, one simple question echoed. What did I do wrong? Victoria Hayes was the type of person who didn't need to raise her voice to make others obey, because the way she spoke, the way she moved, the way she looked, made the person in front of her automatically feel inferior. At 47, she had spent nearly 2 decades climbing the ranks in this conservative banking system, not by kindness, but by her ability to read her customers and place the right people into the right boxes in her social hierarchy system. White skin, Armani suit, Midwestern accent, easily placed in the priority box. Southern accent, school uniform, dark brown skin. Sorry, caution box. To Victoria, Elijah Carter would never belong here. It didn't matter where he came from, it didn't matter who his father was, and it certainly didn't matter that the check he held was entirely legitimate. Just one look, and she had made her judgment. And in her cushioned world, that boy was just an out-of-place mark that needed to be silently eliminated. Across the room, a female employee watched the entire scene. Melody Tran, an Asian American, the only one who briefly squinted with disapproval, but she stayed silent. She had once been reprimanded by Victoria for smiling too friendly at a Hispanic customer just last week. Elijah remained standing still. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He didn't argue. But in his head a strange emotion began to rise. It wasn't just hurt, it was a burning mixture of humiliation and anger. And he knew. This was no longer about depositing money. This was a test, a slap in the face to his self-worth that he had built through countless hours of studying, late nights writing papers, and every question answered with his own effort. The $5,000 check was now locked in the temporary vault. But what was really being held back was Elijah's right to be trusted. Elijah stood there, silently and stiffly, in the corner of the bank where the glances passed over him as if he were a system glitch, an inconvenience no one wanted to acknowledge, let alone explain. He looked over to the counter. Tom Reeves had returned to serving another customer, his face returning to its usual neutral expression as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Victoria Hayes continued to pace the lobby, her heels clicking steadily on the marble floor, her eyes scanning like a radar, swiftly sweeping over each person. Elijah glanced at the wall clock. Nearly 20 minutes had passed. His check had still not been processed. No one had asked. No one had explained. Worry began to creep into every cell of his body. His father, Daniel Carter, was currently at the company headquarters downtown. His board meeting had started at 10 a.m., but his father had once told him, "If anything unusual happens, just call. I'll leave any meeting to be with you." Elijah didn't want to call. He wanted to prove that he could handle this with maturity. But now, the situation was no longer about a simple bank transaction. It had become a silent confrontation, where he was being treated as a threat. He took a breath and approached the reception desk where Victoria was reviewing her notes. His voice was low, but clear. "Excuse me, I just need a call. I left my phone at school. My dad is waiting for me." Victoria didn't look up. She just turned another page in her notebook and responded in a dry, cold tone, like an unpaid bill. "Not our concern. You stay there. We'll process it when we see fit." Elijah bit his lip. For the first time, he felt his pride breaking. Not because his request was denied, but because of the way she denied it, leaving no room for dignity. The words were simple, but their meaning was unmistakable. "You don't matter." Before Elijah could turn back to his original position, Victoria looked up, her eyes quickly darting to the corner of the lobby. A slight nod, no words, signaling to the security guard nearby. The security guard was a large man, dressed in a dark blue uniform named Carter Briggs, around 50 years old. His gaze was indifferent, already familiar with wordless orders. He moved toward Elijah, standing at a 45-degree angle, just enough not to make noise, but enough to make Elijah understand that he was being watched. Elijah turned, his eyes meeting that gaze. No anger, no friendliness, just the silent caution of someone taught that black children cause trouble. Elijah felt his hand grip his backpack straps tighter. His mouth was dry. A part of him wanted to walk out of the bank. Another part wanted to scream. But the deepest part of him just wanted someone to stand up and say, "This boy hasn't done anything wrong." But no one did. The adults around him, those withdrawing money, sipping free coffee, all saw the scene. A boy detained, monitored, simply for handing over a $5,000 check. But no one said anything. They were too used to people like Elijah being treated as though they didn't belong. Victoria walked past Elijah, not looking directly at him, but her words fell like a silk-covered blade. Best not to cause trouble. There have been some unfortunate incidents lately with young people lacking patience. Her words weren't threatening, but Elijah clearly heard a vague but chilling implication. He remembered the news about a black teenager who had been called on by the police for standing too long in a bank just waiting for his mother. He recalled a case from another state, where a student was forced to kneel in the middle of a store for being suspected of using a fake credit card. The card was his father's. And now Elijah realized he could be the next name. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. His small shoulders didn't flinch, but inside, a storm raged. He looked around. Melody Tran was still standing in the corner on the right, glancing at him, but staying silent. A middle-aged man nearby pretended to scroll on his phone, but his eyes still looked over at this side through the glass reflection. The entire bank lobby, with its crystal chandeliers, expensive stone floors and banners reading "Fair treatment for all customers," was witnessing a boy being isolated like an undefined commodity. The check sat in the vault. Trust was being withheld, and he was stripped of the right to speak. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment. He imagined his father's voice in his ear. "You will face injustice, Elijah, but you must know when to be silent and when to stand up." He didn't know what to do next, but he was sure of one thing: he was not wrong. Elijah stood still in the hallway lined with glossy stone tiles running along the edge of the banking hall. A corner, just secluded enough not to block the passage, but too empty for no one to notice. A place where the lights shone harsher, the floor colder, and every sound, no matter how small, rang sharp as metal. The security guard had returned to his position but kept his eyes fixed on him. Tom continued serving other customers. Meanwhile, Victoria Hayes, in her perfect gray suit, with her blonde hair neatly curled like a model, continued to pace the hall, as though she were orchestrating a stage where everyone was just a pawn she could manipulate. Only Elijah was no longer a customer. He was slowly becoming a symbol of abnormality, an isolated shadow in a room where everything was designed to exude politeness. Then, as an invisible chain reaction, whispers began to rise. Did he steal the check? A kid like him gets a scholarship? An elderly woman, wearing glasses, sitting 3 seats away, pulled her handbag closer to her. Another bank employee passed by, glancing at Elijah, then turned to whisper something to the person next to her, and they both laughed. Customers came and went. No one spoke to him, but their looks said enough. "You don't belong here." Elijah gently lifted a hand to brush his hair. Not to fix it, but just to do something. A small action to remind himself that he still had control over his body. His hand was cold, his heartbeat steady, but each beat thudded against his eardrums. He tried to take a deep breath. His father's words echoed like a protective mantra. Never get angry, son. People will find any excuse to make you lose control. You don't have the privilege of getting angry. Keep yourself together. Elijah gritted his teeth. He had encountered injustice. He had seen favoritism, but never had it been so direct. He didn't need anyone to say that his skin color was the problem. This entire space had already said it for him. At the front desk, Victoria was attending to an elderly white couple who had just entered. She smiled brightly, shook their hands, and personally led them to the VIP section by the window, where there was free black coffee and velvet-cushioned chairs. Just 5 minutes earlier, a black man, dressed in a wrinkled gray shirt and carrying a folder, had entered. Elijah had seen him walk up to the customer service desk, politely ask for advice on a small business account, but as soon as Victoria saw him, she waved him off coldly. "The system is running slow. Come back later." He nodded silently and walked out, looking disappointed. No one apologized to him. No one asked for more information. Then, another white couple entered. Same paperwork, same request. But Victoria suddenly brightened, inviting them to a private table, and even called another employee to serve them more coffee. Elijah watched it all, and something clicked inside him. This wasn't delays due to verification. This was selection. This was exclusion. This was discrimination. A sound broke the silence, the click of Victoria's high heels approaching. She glanced at Elijah as though he were a forgotten object to be discarded, then said, loud enough for the security guard to hear, "Keep an eye on him. Don't let him wander off. We still have to verify." Elijah turned his face away. He didn't want anyone to see his eyes starting to redden. Not because of weakness, but because of rage. But he still didn't move. He didn't even step out of his spot. A 14-year-old boy using silence to fight against the cold humiliation dressed in professionalism. The punishment in this place didn't come from physical blows. It came from looks no one wanted to explain, from long, drawn-out moments no one bothered to end, and from an invisibility deliberately imposed. At that moment, a bank employee, Melody Tran, passed by and stopped briefly. She looked at Elijah. This time, she didn't look away. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, just loud enough for him to hear. Elijah nodded, not speaking. Melody didn't say anything else, but her eyes softened. He could feel it. She saw. She knew, but she was also bound. And so, yet another person chose to remain silent because they didn't know how much they were allowed to speak up. Elijah looked up at the high ceiling of the bank, where the lights reflected like stars framed in a space of power. But right now, to him, those lights weren't bright. They just illuminated one truth more clearly. Sometimes, a place called customer service becomes a place to test one's patience and humanity, and where financial justice should be protected, it became the quietest form of mental torture. The lights in the bank lobby still shone down on the head of Elijah Carter, 14 years old, as a cruel reminder that he was standing there, alone, not to be served, but to be surveilled. He no longer felt the passage of time. All that remained were long moments like a rope tightening around his neck, pulling each second taut with silent waiting. And then, when he looked up, he caught sight of something that would stay with him for life. Victoria Hayes, the woman who had waved him off as if he were a beggar, was smiling brightly. She bent slightly to shake hands with a white man in a beige suit, accompanied by his wife carrying a dark-colored Hermes handbag. They had just stepped into the bank, and within 3 steps they were greeted by Victoria as if they were long-time VIP clients. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Gilmore. It's been a while since you visited our branch. Today I'll personally assist you, she said with a voice as sweet as honey. She waved over to a distant staff member, signaling to prepare a private room. Elijah saw a silver tea tray and gold-rimmed porcelain cups brought out in less than 2 minutes. He didn't need to ask any more questions. He didn't need anyone to explain, just compare. Less than 15 minutes earlier, a middle-aged Hispanic man wearing a faded gray shirt had walked in, carrying a folder and an old baseball cap. Elijah remembered his face clearly as he smiled, trying his best to be polite, and asked Victoria, "Hello, I'd like to inquire about opening an account for a small business." Victoria barely glanced at him. "The system's slow. Please come back later." She turned away without waiting for a thank you. Elijah had felt something was wrong back then. But now, seeing the stark contrast, one person rejected without reason, another welcomed like royalty, all his doubts vanished. This wasn't personal, this wasn't about procedure, this was an unspoken policy, a mechanism for choosing who deserved to be welcomed, and who needed to be dismissed with just one glance. Elijah furrowed his brow. Part of him wanted to step forward and ask directly, "Why was I asked to wait over 30 minutes without anyone checking my paperwork, while they were led to a private room in just 2 minutes?" But he knew just that one action, just raising his voice even slightly, would change the entire room's gaze from suspicion to aggression. Because he was the black boy standing alone in the bank, no one accompanying him, no phone, no witnesses. His father, Daniel Carter, had once said something Elijah would never forget. "You need to know that with the same action, if you do it, people will call it disturbing. If someone else does it, it will be called a reasonable response. The problem isn't with the action, it's with the eyes of the person looking at you." Now, those words echoed, not just as a warning, but as a survival guide. Elijah didn't take his eyes off Victoria. She was now bending down, whispering something to the couple, then laughing softly, her finger pointing lightly at a profit chart displayed on a tablet screen. The difference wasn't just in the language. It was in the tone, the expression, the body distance, and even the frequency of blinking. These micro details were enough to turn a simple transaction into a memorable conversation, or a silent interrogation. Elijah realized that he had never been looked at in such a way by her. From the moment he handed over the check, Elijah had become a threat to be watched in Victoria's eyes. In the corner of the bank, Melody Tran, the only employee who had shown any kindness, still glanced at Elijah. She stood behind the counter processing paperwork, tapping lightly on the keyboard, but never taking her eyes off the isolated boy. The helplessness was clear in her gaze. She didn't dare act because she knew standing up against Victoria Hayes wasn't just an ethical act, it was betting her career. And in this bank, righteousness was a costly concept. Not everyone could afford it. Elijah sighed, a long, slow breath, as if he had just walked through a dense forest full of traps. But instead of finding freedom at the exit, he found himself drawn deeper into the maze. He began to understand something that textbooks never taught. Racism no longer comes from rude words or disdainful glances. It comes from selective silence, from conditional handshakes, and from nods that never point toward people like him. He stood there, the 14-year-old boy with a legitimate scholarship, real paperwork, and proper behavior, and was seen as unworthy of trust. And in that setting, truth became the rarest luxury. Elijah stood still, his back lightly pressed against the polished oak wood paneling, his eyes scanning every movement in the bank's lobby. He had stopped hoping that someone would explain, apologize, or at least acknowledge that he had done nothing wrong. Now, all of his focus was on observing. And from that, he began to see things no one else seemed to notice. A glass door at the back of the lobby opened. The man walked in. Tall, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, a perfectly tailored black suit, a black tie tied neatly, his steps slow but decisive. A man who needed no introduction, because just the way Victoria Hayes immediately turned around, adjusted her blazer and smiled, Elijah knew. This man had power. And just a few seconds later, the name flashed in Elijah's mind like an electric current. Harrison Wells. That name had come up many times at family dinners, usually when his father, Daniel Carter, talked about high-stakes financial deals. Wells is an old fox. Anything he can't buy with money, he buys with secrets. Wells was the CEO of Meridian Banking Group, a direct competitor of Carter & Cole, the company his father founded and ran. Once, Elijah heard his father say, "Wells has tried to take over Oak Federal 3 times in 7 years, but each time we've stopped him." And now, in this bank, Elijah was watching Harrison Wells shake hands with Victoria Hayes, the same woman who had insulted, humiliated, and isolated him less than an hour ago. No one in the room noticed. No one saw the anomaly, but Elijah saw it. And he didn't look away. Victoria extended her hand toward the desk next to the VIP area. She pulled out a yellow manila folder, stamped with a red seal on the top corner. Confidential. In one small discreet movement, she handed it to Wells. No explanation to the surrounding staff. No documentation. No cameras facing that area. A perfect blind spot in the lobby layout that Elijah had seen before. Wells took the file, flipping it open as if he already knew the contents. His eyes narrowed as he skimmed through the pages, his mouth remaining still, but his expression clearly showing satisfaction. A slight nod. Then he tucked the folder into his brown leather briefcase, locking it with a silver clasp. The entire exchange took less than 3 minutes, but it was enough for Elijah to understand. This was not a routine banking transaction. His hand clenched the strap of his backpack. His heart raced, no longer from fear, but from the fury that was building up to its maximum. He knew no one would believe the word of a 14-year-old boy standing in the corner of the room. But he also knew that this couldn't just stop at observation. Elijah glanced down at the black leather notebook hanging from his backpack, the one he always used for notes, study plans, and to track the oddities in his school life. He opened it and quickly jotted down 10:47 a.m. Harrison Wells, CEO Meridian, appeared. Victoria Hayes handed over confidential file. No supervision. Wells left with the documents. When Elijah looked up, Victoria had returned to the lobby. The professional smile on her face had faded. Instead, she wore an unusually focused expression. But her gaze, when it met Elijah's for a brief moment, froze. Not surprise, not fear, but awareness. Victoria realized Elijah had witnessed the entire exchange. Her eyes drilled into him, silently questioning, "What did you see? How much do you know?" And Elijah responded with a silent, unwavering stare. A wordless challenge from a child who was no longer a customer, but a witness. He didn't know the contents of the file, but he knew one thing. If Harrison Wells had gotten anything from Victoria, it was certainly illegal, and perhaps his father's bank was being betrayed from the inside. At this point, Elijah was no longer the child humiliated for his skin color. He had become the holder of a darker secret, and the scariest part, he had only just begun to see the surface. Elijah's hand trembled slightly as he placed the first stroke of his pen on the ivory-colored page. The ink from the black ballpoint pen followed every small movement, steady like the breath of someone walking in the dark. Each letter, each line acting like a tether to steady the reality that was beginning to distort before his eyes. 10:47 a.m. Harrison Wells appears. Victoria Hayes hands over confidential file. Wells nods. No one witnesses, no receipt is recorded. The documents are taken out of the bank. Each word Elijah wrote was neat, careful, aligned. Just like his father had taught him. The truth doesn't need to be shouted, just write it down correctly. His left hand lightly rested on the notebook, covering what he had written. Because he knew, if Victoria or anyone else saw what he was recording, their silence would no longer be indifferent. It would become pressure. It could be coercion. It could be a threat. And he was only 14. No one would stand up for him unless there was proof. He lifted his head, his eyes scanning the familiar room that now seemed filled with hidden meanings. Every person, every step, every movement, all seemed normal. But beneath that surface was a system with selectivity, stratification, where power and guilt walked hand in hand, wrapped in glass, the scent of oak wood and slogans like integrity, trust, serving the community. Victoria Hayes was standing at the counter, answering something to Tom Reeves, her face unusually tense. Gone was the perfect receptionist smile she always wore. Gone was the self-satisfied expression. Instead, there was a defensive look. For a brief moment, her eyes darted toward Elijah. It wasn't contempt this time, but evaluation. Elijah immediately understood. She knows I saw. And now she's wondering what I'm going to do with that. He looked away, but not to avoid her gaze, just playing the part of a scared child, as they wanted him to appear. But inside, Elijah was ready. He knew what he had witnessed could be evidence of a conspiracy, a betrayal, even an act of selling insider information, an offense enough to ruin anyone's career. The boy's mind raced faster than ever. He reviewed every detail. How had Victoria hidden the file so well? Had anyone else in the bank seen? No recordings, but Wells' look had confirmed. He was satisfied. Elijah hadn't just witnessed a shady transaction. He had seen collaboration between an insider and a top competitor. And, ironically, everything had unfolded right in front of a child the entire system had tried to ignore. He recalled his father's words from a weekend evening when they were watching an economic news broadcast. When someone is hiding something significant, they'll think the child is the last person who will understand. And that's when you have the advantage. Now, those words weren't just a theory. They were alive, taking form, and the only person who could expose it was Elijah Carter. He lowered his pen once more, writing the final line clearly. I am not invisible. I am remembering everything. And then, gently, he turned the page, a new blank page, not to forget, but to prepare. He still didn't know what he would do next. He only knew that if he stayed silent, if he ignored it, if he let Victoria and Wells continue their actions, this bank might collapse, his family's reputation would be tarnished, and the truth would be buried in a locked file forever. No, Elijah wouldn't let that happen. From his position, he looked up at the wall clock. 11:06 a.m. Almost an hour had passed since he walked into the bank with a confident smile and a scholarship check. Now, he was no longer the boy there to deposit a check. He was the only witness to a conspiracy, and he had to survive this place with the truth. Elijah Carter carefully closed his black leather notebook, his fingers gripping the spine as if afraid that the moment he let go, everything he had written would vanish from reality, just like how his trust in fairness here had evaporated. On the marble floor, the sound of Victoria Hayes's high heels echoed again. No longer the leisurely steps she had before. Now, each step was quicker, more hurried, like the ticking of an alarm clock in the mind of someone who knows they've just made a mistake. When she stopped in the middle of the lobby, her gaze landed directly on Elijah and lingered longer than necessary. Elijah didn't lower his head, he didn't look away, but inside, an indescribable feeling crept in. She knew. He had witnessed. He had recorded. And now, he had become a threat. Victoria subtly turned her head, leaning toward the security counter. No words were necessary, just a light hand gesture, a sharp eyebrow raise. Carter Briggs, the large, muscular security guard, immediately understood the signal. He left his position and walked toward Elijah. His heavy footsteps were slow, like a warning beat. When he reached Elijah, he stood at an angle, silent, his arms crossed as he looked at him with eyes full of unspoken meaning. "I'm here. You're not going anywhere." Elijah felt every muscle in his body tense. His heart pounded so loudly that he could hear each beat in his ears. He wasn't afraid of being harmed, at least not in a physical way. But he knew that if he were pulled into a private room, if he were separated from this public space, then anything he said would go unheard. If they take me to a private room, will anyone know? The question gnawed at Elijah's mind like sharp claws. He remembered the stories his father had told him about temporary detentions with no records, about internal surveillance that was really just whitewashing through silence. And he knew he was standing at the threshold of that moment. Victoria didn't approach Elijah right away. She stood from a distance, leaning against the reception desk, pretending to go through a stack of files. But her eyes, those eyes were still locked onto the boy standing in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and the coldness of power. He could see it clearly. She was calculating. Should she act immediately? Was anyone watching? Had the boy said anything to anyone yet? The hesitation in Victoria's eyes didn't last long. She pulled out her phone from her jacket pocket, quickly scrolling through a message, then glanced over at Elijah. Very quickly, as if she were setting up a solution. Elijah understood that he was no longer just a young customer being discriminated against. He had become the one who could expose the secret. At that moment, something changed in Elijah's gaze. No longer was he the boy waiting for his father to pick him up. No longer was he the student with a scholarship check, afraid of being lost in the adult world. Now, he held the truth in his hands. And he knew. If he faltered now, no one else would speak for him. He gently touched the edge of the notebook hanging from his backpack, where every line of writing was kept. The exact time Wells arrived. The name of the staff member at the counter. The confidential file being handed over. No cameras recording the area behind the desk. He had seen. He had written. And now, they were considering silencing him. From a distance, Melody Tran was still at her station, her worried eyes scanning Elijah. In that brief moment, their gazes met. And Elijah knew. She had seen the security guard being mobilized. No one said anything. No one did anything. But now, every move in this bank had a purpose. And that purpose was Elijah Carter. He took a deep breath, like he was preparing to step onto a stage, though this stage had no fair audience, no neutral director, only the person controlling the lights, trying to obscure the truth. Let them think I'm just a clueless kid, Elijah thought to himself. But I will keep observing and preparing. Because now, he was not just a witness. He was the only one who hadn't been bought, not subdued, and there was no turning back. Elijah Carter knew he was standing at the very edge between patience and surrender. The tension in the bank lobby was like thin glass, transparent, almost invisible, but a small jolt was enough to shatter everything. And it was in that moment, when Victoria's gaze locked onto him as though testing his final submission, that Elijah made his choice. It wasn't the safe choice. It was the choice to speak. He took a small step forward from his position, his voice trembling from the years of restraint, but each word came out stronger than he had expected. "I'm not a thief. I'm here to deposit a scholarship check because I deserve it." The atmosphere in the lobby froze. The clicking of keyboards stopped. The spoons in coffee cups stilled midair, and the gaze of almost everyone, for the first time in the last hour, focused on Elijah. The 14-year-old black boy in his school uniform, standing straight in the middle of the grand lobby, offering no apology, no justification, no pleading. Just asserting one thing: he deserved to be there. Victoria Hayes didn't flinch. She wasn't angry like someone who had been contradicted. She simply lowered her gaze, gave a thin, dismissive smile, and then turned to security guard Carter Briggs. "Take him to the back room. Keep him there until I'm done." Her voice was as cold as stone in a Boston winter. Not loud, but clear. It wasn't a hasty command. It was the action of dealing with a disruptive object. That boy, in her eyes, had done the one thing that wasn't allowed: spoken up. Carter Briggs didn't ask questions. He moved toward Elijah, his large hand grabbing his arm. He didn't squeeze tightly, but just enough to send a clear message. No resistance. No questions. No choices. Elijah instinctively froze. Not because he feared pain, but because this was really happening. In broad daylight, in the middle of the bank, with dozens of customers witnessing it. He was being escorted like a suspect, even though he was the one with a scholarship, with legitimate paperwork, and had never raised his voice until that very moment. He turned his head. The faces were clear: the man typing on the computer, the coffee shop employee, the customer withdrawing money, all were watching. But no one spoke. No one stopped him. No one asked, "What's going on? What did that boy do wrong?" Just averted gazes, a few furrowed brows, a silent complicity wrapped in the excuse of not being involved. Elijah was led down a side hallway. A glass door with frosted decals appeared. Private guest room, staff only. He knew the real meaning behind it. A place out of view from outsiders. A place where voices bounced back off the walls. And it was in that moment, as his foot crossed the threshold, that Elijah understood. If I hadn't spoken up just now, this would have still happened. But now, at least I've left a mark. I didn't stay silent. He was pushed into a cold plastic chair in the room. Carter Briggs stood blocking the door, arms crossed, his eyes staring straight at him, like a guard. The room had no cameras, no windows, nothing to reassure him. But what gave Elijah some comfort was that the notebook in his backpack was still intact, and he had spoken. Back in the main lobby, Victoria Hayes returned to the counter, straightening her collar, then smiling politely at the next customer couple. Everything fell back into order as if nothing had happened, but behind that smile was a crack. That boy saw, and now he's starting to speak. Victoria felt control slipping from her grasp, and that was something she could never allow. Elijah Carter sat motionless in the cold plastic chair in the small windowless room. His back slightly hunched, his hand still resting on the strap of his backpack as an instinctive form of self-defense. The sensation of being stripped of space, of voice, and of respect. It all weighed down on his shoulders like a heavy lead blanket. Outside, the faint sounds of the bank echoed through the walls. The clicking of heels, the ringing of the doorbell, the hum of the printer, distant, as though belonging to a world he no longer had permission to belong to. The door behind him wasn't locked, but it was tightly guarded. Carter Briggs stood there like an immovable wall with no escape. His eyes occasionally glanced at Elijah, not with malice nor regret, just accustomed to orders and unwilling to question them. Elijah lowered his head, not out of exhaustion, but because part of him was starting to want to surrender. The feeling of being surrounded, excluded, and silenced, so familiar to people like him, yet never less painful. And then, Kang. The bank door opened. The familiar chime rang again, but this time it didn't fade into the background like it usually did. This time, it rang out like a signal of change. A tall man stepped into the middle of the lobby, his posture decisive, his gaze sharp as tempered steel. His charcoal-colored suit was tailored perfectly, his silk tie neatly tied, his wrist adorned with a Patek Philippe watch not to show off, but to remind those around him that his time was something not to be wasted. Daniel Carter. No one in the bank spoke his name, but almost everyone recognized him immediately. A few employees froze. Tom Reeves, the one who had checked Elijah's check like a suspicious item, dropped his pen on the desk. Melody Tran's mouth hung open. Victoria Hayes turned her head. The look in her eyes shifted instantly, from active to defensive, from authoritative to cautious. "Mr. Carter," she spoke first, trying to maintain professionalism. But Daniel didn't respond. His eyes scanned the lobby, not to find the manager, not to ask for directions, but to find a familiar face he didn't see. And then he turned to the nearest employee, his voice low but clear. "My son, Elijah Carter. Where is he?" No one answered immediately. No one wanted to be the one to speak. That name, Elijah, now felt like a code that threw the entire system off beat. Victoria stepped forward, trying to hold herself together, but her voice trembled slightly. I believe the boy is in the back waiting room. We're just—" "I didn't ask for reasons," Daniel interrupted. "I asked where he is." His voice wasn't loud, but there was something colder than anger in each word, a kind of authority that didn't need to be flaunted, just needed to be present. She was about to speak again, but he walked past her as if she didn't exist. Elijah heard the sound of shoes, the distinct, steady click of leather shoes on the stone floor, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. He looked up, and his gaze met his father's. Daniel stopped right at the door of the room. No words immediately, just a look, a gaze that pierced through every distance, every door, every nameless wound. Elijah didn't cry, but the hand gripping the strap of his backpack loosened. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice still steady, but his eyes were flames. I was held," Elijah replied, his voice shaking but his gaze unwavering. "They said my scholarship check was suspicious." Daniel didn't ask further. He turned and glanced at Carter Briggs, just a single look, and without a word, the security guard stepped back, as though being thrown from the wall of power he thought he controlled. Just a few minutes later, Elijah walked out of that room. No longer the isolated boy, but the one about to make this entire bank face the truth. Daniel stood next to his son, his hand resting lightly on his shoulder. In Elijah's hand, still the black leather notebook. He didn't need any other weapon, just the truth, and the one who had listened. Elijah stepped out of the room like he was escaping from a glass prison. A prison everyone saw, but no one called by its true name. And right at the door, Daniel Carter was waiting. He didn't say a word to Victoria. No need. Everything that needed to be said was already clear in his gaze. A look of a father who had just discovered his son had been humiliated, and a CEO who had just realized that the system he trusted was being breached from within. He walked up, knelt on one knee, and placed his hand gently on his son's shoulder. "Elijah, what happened?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He quietly opened his backpack, pulling out the black leather notebook he had always considered his rearview mirror of memory. Every page was a silence that had been recorded, and now it had become his weapon. He opened to the last page he had written, handed it to his father. No words, no explanations. Daniel took it, reading each line slowly, one by one. Harrison Wells appeared at 10:47. Victoria Hayes handed over the confidential file. No supervision, no official record. Wells left with documents belonging to Oak Federal. Beneath, Elijah had clearly noted, "At the same time, I was denied the right to make a call, kept in the room, and treated like a criminal." Daniel didn't close the notebook. He still held it in his hand as he stood up, but his face was no longer that of a father. It was the face of a storm beginning to form. He walked straight to the front desk, where Victoria Hayes was standing holding her tablet, trying to maintain her indifferent expression as if everything was just as planned. But Daniel's eyes, cold, silent, sharp as steel, made every layer of her disguise fall away. "Miss Hayes," he said slowly, each word landing like a hammer, "I have evidence showing that you discriminated against a customer, abused your power, and leaked internal documents to a competitor." The entire lobby fell silent, as if someone had sucked all the air out of the room. Tom Reeves, the teller who had handled Elijah's check, dropped his pen on the desk. Another security guard outside the door looked at Victoria, his gaze wavering. Melody Tran stood still in the distance, holding a stack of documents, her face unchanged, but her eyes were burning with quiet fire. Victoria still tried to cling to her last mask. She curled her lips, speaking through gritted teeth. "I don't understand what you're talking about. If this is about the boy, I was just following protocol." "No," Daniel interrupted, his voice not loud, but enough for the entire bank to hear. "You didn't follow protocol. You abused your authority. You illegally detained a minor. You refused to allow a phone call, and most importantly, you assisted Harrison Wells, a direct business rival, by handing him confidential information from this bank." He raised Elijah's notebook high. "It's all recorded, clear timestamps, clear names, clear actions, and there are witnesses." Victoria took a step back. For the first time that day, her face truly changed. She looked around. No one avoided her gaze. No one lowered their head. No one showed any sympathy. The people who had once smiled politely at her, who had avoided her when she passed by, now stood silently, watching. Daniel didn't give her the chance to escape with words. "I didn't come here to ask for an explanation. I came here to end this. Ms. Hayes, you are suspended, effective immediately, and you will be internally investigated, both for your unethical actions and the possibility of involvement in corporate espionage." Though the words weren't read by a judge, they landed like a sentence. Victoria opened her mouth, but no words formed into sentences. The power she had once used to suppress Elijah, to keep him silent, afraid in that cold corner, had now been turned on her, and no one stood between to shield her. Daniel nodded slightly toward another security guard. "Take her out of here, and make sure everything is documented." The guard nodded and moved toward her without delay. Victoria didn't resist. She walked away, her heels clicking on the floor, no longer controlling the space, but like a death knell for the false power that had just been exposed. Elijah stood next to his father, still silent. But this time, it wasn't because he was forbidden to speak. It was because everything he needed to say, his father had already said it for him, and those words had not only saved him, but were now beginning to save the bank from the very sickness it had refused to acknowledge. Victoria Hayes had never been accustomed to being contradicted, let alone imagined a day when her power, built over nearly 2 decades, would be overturned right in the very place she had established it. But now, standing before Daniel Carter, a top-tier CEO and a father protecting his son, she was completely lost. Her face turned pale, her lips trembled as if her brain was scrambling to find a way to turn the situation around. "Mr. Carter, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I was just following procedure. That boy was acting strangely and the files hadn't been verified. As for Harrison Wells, I didn't—" Daniel raised his hand, cutting her off for the second time. But this time his voice wasn't a warning. It was a verdict. "You're fired, effective immediately." In that moment, the entire space seemed to freeze. The sound of typing stopped. The printing machines halted. The card swipe machines blinked and then went silent. A female employee behind the counter slowly picked up the internal phone, dialed 4 digits, no questions asked, and spoke softly. "Call internal security. Main lobby, urgent." Victoria turned to the employees around her, her eyes pleading. But no one responded. No one looked at her with pity. Those who had once been cautious around her now stood tall, as if invisible chains had been lifted from them. Tom Reeves, the young teller who had handled Elijah's check, lowered his head, saying nothing. But the brief glance he gave showed he knew what was right, and he had been silent for far too long. Less than a minute later, 2 tall security guards appeared. They moved toward her, not hastily but with purpose. No one spoke. There was no need to repeat the orders. Victoria took a step back. For the first time in her life, she looked small and lost. I have the right to file a complaint with the board. Daniel nodded calmly. "Do what you feel is necessary. But Elijah's records will be sent directly to the executive board. And I've already informed the bank's legal representative. You're not just facing dismissal, you'll have to answer to the Financial Ethics Board and to the court if necessary." His voice had no trace of anger, only an absolute certainty in every syllable. It was the voice of someone accustomed to battlefields, and this time the battlefield was right in front of his son. The 2 security guards nodded and motioned for her to leave. Victoria glanced one last time at the counter, where the power had once belonged to her, then turned and walked away, her back straight but her hands clenched, nails digging into her skin. Elijah watched her go, not with satisfaction, not with triumph. Just lighter, as if the weight that had been pressing down on his chest for the past hour had finally been lifted. Daniel placed his hand on his son's shoulder. No words of praise were needed. His presence, and the way he did what was right, was the highest affirmation Elijah could receive. The entire bank lobby remained silent after Victoria left. Daniel turned, looking directly at the employees standing nearby, and said clearly, "I didn't come here as a shareholder or a CEO. I came here as a father. And I want all of you to know this. No one, no matter who they are, should be treated the way my son was treated today." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "From now on, every act of favoritism, discrimination, and abuse of power at this branch will be audited. And I and the new board of directors, will ensure that no one ever has to write in Elijah's notebook again." His gaze was no longer as sharp as a knife, but filled with humanity. And in that silence, the first round of applause rang out. From Melody Tran, The young employee who had remained silent all morning now stood up, clapping, as if to say, "Finally, someone had stood up." The applause spread like wildfire across the dry field. One person, then two, then the whole lobby. Elijah stood in the middle of it all, not as a victim, but as the one who had led the transformation. Elijah stepped out of the room as though escaping from a glass prison. A prison that everyone could see but no one dared name. And right at the door, Daniel Carter was waiting. He didn't say a word to Victoria. No need. Everything that needed to be said was already clear in his gaze. The look of a father who had just discovered his son had been humiliated, and a CEO who had just realized that the system he trusted was being breached from within. He walked up, knelt on one knee, and placed his hand gently on his son's shoulder. "Elijah, what happened?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. He quietly opened his backpack, pulling out the black leather notebook he had always considered his rearview mirror of memory. Every page was a silence that had been recorded, and now it had become his weapon. He opened to the last page he had written, handed it to his father. No words, no explanations. Daniel took it, reading each line slowly, one by one. Harrison Wells appeared at 10:47. Victoria Hayes handed over the confidential file. No supervision, no official record. Wells left with documents belonging to Oak Federal. Beneath, Elijah had clearly noted, "At the same time, I was denied the right to make a call, kept in the room, and treated like a criminal." Daniel didn't close the notebook. He still held it in his hand as he stood up, but his face was no longer that of a father. It was the face of a storm beginning to form. He walked straight to the front desk, where Victoria Hayes was standing, holding her tablet, trying to maintain her indifferent expression as if everything was just as planned. But Daniel's eyes, cold, silent, sharp as steel, made every layer of her disguise fall away. "Miss Hayes," he said slowly, each word landing like a hammer, "I have evidence showing that you discriminated against a customer, abused your power, and leaked internal documents to a competitor." The entire lobby fell silent, as if someone had sucked all the air out of the room. Tom Reeves, the teller who had handled Elijah's check, dropped his pen on the desk. Another security guard outside the door looked at Victoria, his gaze wavering. Melody Tran stood still in the distance, holding a stack of documents, her face unchanged, but her eyes were burning with quiet fire. Victoria still tried to cling to her last mask. She curled her lips, speaking through gritted teeth. "I don't understand what you're talking about. If this is about the boy, I was just following protocol." "No," Daniel interrupted, his voice not loud, but enough for the entire bank to hear. "You didn't follow protocol. You abused your authority, you illegally detained a minor, you refused to allow a phone call, and most importantly, you assisted Harrison Wells, a direct business rival, by handing him confidential information from this bank." He raised Elijah's notebook high. "It's all recorded, clear timestamps, clear names, clear actions, and there are witnesses." Victoria took a step back. For the first time that day, her face truly changed. She looked around. No one avoided her gaze. No one lowered their head. No one showed any sympathy. The people who had once smiled politely at her, who had avoided her when she passed by, now stood silently, watching. Daniel didn't give her the chance to escape with words. "I didn't come here to ask for an explanation. I came here to end this. Ms. Hayes, you are suspended, effective immediately, and you will be internally investigated, both for your unethical actions and the possibility of involvement in corporate espionage." Though the words weren't read by a judge, they landed like a sentence. Victoria opened her mouth, but no words formed into sentences. The power she had once used to suppress Elijah, to keep him silent, afraid, in that cold corner, had now been turned on her, and no one stood between to shield her. Daniel nodded slightly toward another security guard. "Take her out of here, and make sure everything is documented." The guard nodded and moved toward her without delay. Victoria didn't resist. She walked away, her heels clicking on the floor, no longer controlling the space but like a death knell for the false power that had just been exposed. Elijah stood next to his father, still silent. But this time, it wasn't because he was forbidden to speak. It was because everything he needed to say, his father had already said it for him. And those words had not only saved him, but were now beginning to save the bank from the very sickness it had refused to acknowledge. 3 weeks after that fateful morning at the bank, Elijah Carter stood on the wooden stage of the large auditorium at Wester Academy, beneath the traditional banners. Veritas, Integritas, Disciplina. Truth, integrity, discipline. He wore his school uniform as usual, a neat blazer, a carefully tied tie, his hair combed to the side. But today, Elijah was not just a standout student at Wester. He was the chosen keynote speaker for the entire school's Leading the Path to Justice seminar. Seated in the audience were more than 500 students from various states, different ethnicities and backgrounds. Some had been teased for their poverty. Some had been ignored in class because of their brown skin, frizzy hair, or difficult-to-pronounce names. And now, they were silent, listening to one of their own stand up and recount the journey that forced the entire system to change. Elijah didn't use a PowerPoint. He simply held his familiar black leather notebook. His voice wasn't loud, but each word rang like a bell in the hearts of his listeners. I walked into that bank with pride and left with shame, but what was most terrifying wasn't how they looked at me. It was the feeling. In that moment, I started to believe they were right. A quiet wave spread across the auditorium. Someone lowered their head. Someone clenched the strap of their backpack. But no one took their eyes off Elijah. He continued, "You might be doubted because of your skin, because of the way you enter a room, because they've never seen someone like you in that position. But never let anyone decide what you deserve." Elijah's homeroom teacher, Mrs. Bennett, a gray-haired white woman who had taught debate, sat in the front row, teary-eyed. She remembered. She was the first to tell Elijah that he didn't need to speak so forcefully in class because sometimes people perceive your voice as a threat. Now she understood. She had been a part of the system Elijah had just dismantled. During the Q&A session, an Asian American girl stood up and asked, "How did you stay calm when you were treated so badly?" Elijah thought for a moment, then answered, his eyes never leaving his notebook. "I didn't stay calm. I shook. I was scared. But I remembered my father's words. They may steal your words, but no one can steal the truth when you write it down. So I wrote, and I waited, until I could speak." The entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. A second later, the applause erupted. Not the polite clapping, but the sound of those who had just been given the words for their own pain. That evening, Elijah received a message from a 9th grader he had never spoken to. "I was once held in the security office for carrying a big backpack, but I never told anyone. Thank you for speaking up." Another message came from a white student. "I didn't know the system was like that. I always thought everything was based on effort. Now I see I need to learn how to look again." And then, dozens, even hundreds, of similar responses flooded Elijah's inbox in the week that followed, like arms reaching out from the darkness, all because one person dared to step into the light. In an internal interview with the school advisory team, Elijah was asked, "What do you think makes you a leader?" He looked down at his notebook, then directly into the interviewer's eyes. "I don't lead with willpower. I just don't turn back." At Carter & Cole, Daniel Carter silently watched the seminar via an internal live stream. In his spacious office, he sat alone, his eyes never leaving the screen, where Elijah was speaking before hundreds of students, not using his last name, not relying on his title, just his own voice. He took a sip of his cold coffee, then exhaled quietly. "My son didn't just overcome the challenge. He just created a path." From the Wester Academy auditorium, snippets of Elijah Carter's speech were quickly recorded on phones, edited, and shared across TikTok, Instagram, and later broadcasted on evening news channels. On screen, the 14-year-old boy's deep voice resonated with unwavering determination, his eyes focused, holding a well-worn notebook in his hand. The most repeated quote from his speech echoed through the crowd of hundreds of silent students. "You may be doubted because of your skin color, but never let anyone decide what you deserve." The media called it Elijah's stand-up day. Less than a week later, The Atlantic published an article titled, "From Scholarship to Action: The Black Boy Who Shook the U.S. Banking System." The New York Times wrote in its Sunday section, "He did what many adults shy away from. He held on to integrity in a space designed to make him doubt himself." Nonprofits focused on financial equity invited Elijah to speak. Some public schools in southern states began using his speech as staff training material. Across the nation, people were talking about Elijah Carter, not as a victim, but as a symbol of the youth who know how to observe, document, and rise to the occasion when it matters. At the 27th floor office of Carter & Cole, Daniel Carter sat quietly before a CNN news broadcast. Elijah's image flashed across the screen, not as Daniel Carter's son, but with the caption, "Elijah Carter, 14-year-old student who exposed discrimination and internal revelations at Prestige Oak Federal." Daniel said nothing. He simply watched, feeling something he had never felt clearly, despite all his titles, wealth, and victories in business, a simple, profound pride. Not because Elijah did right, but because Elijah did not back down. He didn't run away when humiliated. He didn't rebel when confined. He didn't remain silent when he saw wrong. And most importantly, he didn't take the easy path. In many schools across the country, talks about the right to trust were held. Students brought Elijah's story to class as a living example. Teachers shared the lesson in ethics class, and for the first time, children who had only known silence in the face of doubt began to speak out. A white student from Vermont wrote in their essay, "Elijah Carter is not just a smart student. He is proof of what schools should teach, that once truth is recorded and spoken, it will never die." A Latina girl from Texas wrote, "Thanks to Elijah, for the first time, I dared to file a complaint when I saw my friend being rejected for an interview because of their accent." As for Elijah, he wasn't seeking the spotlight. He still went to class, did his homework, and participated in the debate team as usual. But every time he walked through the school gates, every time he opened his notebook, he knew everything had changed. Because from a seemingly small banking transaction, Elijah Carter had exposed public discrimination in a professional space, uncovered a whistleblower conspiracy that could cost millions of dollars, changed the policy of a long-standing financial institution, and most importantly, become the voice for hundreds of young people who were forced to remain silent due to prejudice. In a private letter to Elijah, the new CEO of Prestige Oak Federal wrote, "You didn't just make us look back, you made us act, and with that, you've left a mark that time cannot erase." That evening, Elijah sat on the balcony with his father. The sky above wasn't as dark as the winter nights anymore. It was full of stars. "I didn't think it would go this far," Elijah said quietly. Daniel smiled softly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Real fires never know how far they'll burn. They just know they must burn." And Elijah, like that small flame, did not go out. Not when doubted, not when isolated, and certainly not when facing 857 distorted power. He stood up, and an entire system had to change. Elijah Carter didn't choose to become a hero. He just chose not to back down when insulted, not to stay silent when he saw injustice, and not to compromise the truth. From a scholarship check, that 14-year-old boy made an entire system reflect on itself, and reminded us that justice does not come from a title. It comes from the courage of one person, at the right time, in the right place, and for the right reason. What about you? If you were in Elijah's shoes, would you have the courage to speak up, even knowing you'd stand alone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We always want to hear from you. If this story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss out on future content about justice, dignity, and those who quietly but irreversibly change the world. See you in the next story.